The morning of September 17th, 1944, near the Belgian town of Hechtel, Technical Sergeant William McConnah watched through his gunner's periscope as 8 German Panther tanks emerged from the tree line 400 yards ahead. His Sherman M4A1 sat, hull down, behind a brick farm building with its 75mm gun trained on the road junction. The Panthers were moving in column formation, their long-barreled guns sweeping left and right as they advanced toward the American positions. McConaughey's loader, Private First Class Robert Early, had just finished stacking armor-piercing rounds on the turret floor when McConaughey told him to forget the AP and load white phosphorus. Early hesitated. The standing order from the battalion was clear. White phosphorus shells, officially designated M48, were for smoke and suppression only. They were not anti-tank ammunition. Using them against armored vehicles violated doctrine and could result in disciplinary action. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. McConaughey repeated the order. Load Willie Pete. Early grabbed one of the white-banded shells from the ready rack and shoved it into the breech. McConaughey centered his reticle on the lead Panther's turret ring and fired. The shell hit exactly where he aimed. White phosphorus erupted across the Panther's hull in a cascade of burning particles that clung to steel and vision ports and crew hatches. The German tank lurched to a stop. Smoke poured from its engine deck. Within 30 seconds, the crew bailed out through the top hatch, their uniforms smoking. The second Panther tried to reverse. McConaughey's loader already had another white phosphorus round chambered. The shell struck the Panther's front glacis plate. Burning phosphorus splashed across the driver's vision port and spread along the hull seams. The tank kept reversing for another 20 yards before stopping abruptly. The driver's hatch opened. White smoke billowed out. The driver climbed out coughing, followed by the bowgunner. What happened in the next 4 minutes would demonstrate a fundamental gap between official Army doctrine and battlefield reality. The M48 white phosphorus shell was not designed to destroy tanks. It was designed to create smokescreens and suppress enemy infantry. The shell's filler was white phosphorus suspended in a carrier solution. Upon impact, the shell would burst and scatter burning particles that ignited spontaneously when exposed to air. The phosphorus would burn at approximately 2700 degrees Fahrenheit, producing thick white smoke. The intended tactical use was laying smoke to screen troop movements or marking targets for artillery. The shell's official designation listed it as smoke ammunition, not anti-armor. Tank commanders were briefed that white phosphorus had minimal anti-tank capability. The burning particles could not penetrate armor plate. The heat was insufficient to damage internal components. The smoke might temporarily blind enemy crews, but that was a secondary effect, not a primary mission. American tank doctrine, in September 1944, emphasized the use of armor-piercing ammunition against enemy tanks. The M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round was specifically designed to defeat German armor. The 75mm gun on the Sherman could penetrate Panther side armor at ranges under 800 yards. Frontal penetrations were possible at closer ranges if the shot placement was precise. Tank gunnery training focused extensively on shot placement, range estimation, and ammunition selection. Crews learned to identify German tanks by silhouette. They memorized weak points in enemy armor. They practiced loading sequences until they could maintain a sustained rate of fire under combat conditions. The doctrine was clear and supported by testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground. Armor-piercing rounds destroyed tanks. White phosphorus created smoke. Use the correct ammunition for the mission. But McConaughey had noticed something during earlier engagements near Namur. When white phosphorus shells hit near German tanks, the crews would often abandon their vehicles, even when the tanks were still operational. He had watched a Panzer before crew bail out after a white phosphorus round struck the ground 3 feet from their tank and covered the hull in burning particles. The tank was undamaged mechanically. The armor was not penetrated, but the crew would not get back inside. McConaughey had served with the 3rd Armored Division since its deployment to England in September 1943. He was 24 years old, from Pennsylvania, a machinist before the war. He had been trained as a gunner at Fort Knox, where instructors emphasized ammunition discipline. Use the right shell for the right target. Don't waste specialty ammunition on inappropriate targets. White phosphorus was expensive to manufacture and limited in supply. Save it for when you needed smoke. The 3rd Armored Division had landed at Omaha Beach on June 23, 1944, and fought continuously through the breakout from Normandy across France and into Belgium. By mid-September, the division was part of the First Army's drive toward the German border. The operation was moving faster than supply lines could sustain. Fuel shortages were slowing the advance. Ammunition resupply was irregular. Every shell mattered. Tank crews were briefed to conserve ammunition whenever possible. Fire only when you had a clear target. Make every shot count. Don't waste specialty rounds. The standing order from battalion was that white phosphorus shells were for smoke missions only. If you needed to kill a tank, use armor-piercing ammunition. That was doctrine. That was training. That was the official policy. McConnah understood the doctrine. He had fired hundreds of rounds in training and combat. He knew what each shell type was designed to do. But he also understood that doctrine was written by people who were not sitting in a Sherman turret 400 yards from 8 Panther tanks. The crew in that turret had to make decisions based on what was actually happening, not what the manual said should happen. The German Panther AUSFG was one of the most formidable tanks in the Wehrmacht arsenal by September 1944. It mounted a 75mm KWK-42L70 gun capable of penetrating Sherman frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of approximately 140mm against direct fire. Sherman 75mm armor-piercing rounds could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor except at very close range, under ideal conditions. American tank crews learned quickly that engaging Panthers from the front was suicidal unless you could get a shot at the turret ring or the lower glacis plate. The preferred tactic was to maneuver for flank shots where the Panther's side armor was only 40mm thick, but maneuvering for flank shots required terrain that allowed movement, time to execute the maneuver, and enemy cooperation in not shooting you while you tried to get into position. In the Belgian countryside near Hechtel, the terrain was flat with scattered tree lines and farm buildings. There was limited cover. The roads were elevated slightly above the surrounding fields, which were soft from recent rain. Moving off-road meant risking getting stuck. The Germans knew this. They used the roads for their advances and positioned their tanks to control the key junctions. When McConnah's Sherman encountered the 8 Panthers near Hechtel, the tactical situation did not allow for maneuvering. His tank was in a defensive position, covering a road junction. The Panthers were advancing in column directly toward him. He could engage from his current position, or he could withdraw. Withdrawing meant giving up the junction and falling back to the next defensive line. It also meant exposing his Sherman's thinner rear armor while reversing under fire. The standing order was to hold the junction, so McConnah had to engage. The question was which ammunition to use. His loader had armor-piercing rounds ready. Standard procedure said to engage armor with armor-piercing. But McConnah had noticed the psychological effect of white phosphorus in previous encounters, and he had 8 Panthers advancing toward his single Sherman. If he used armor-piercing and failed to achieve killing hits, the Panthers would destroy him with return fire. If he used white phosphorus and the crews bailed out, he could neutralize multiple tanks without having to achieve perfect penetrations on each one. It was not doctrine. It was field expedient, adaptation based on observed enemy behavior, the kind of tactical innovation that emerges when soldiers face situations their training did not fully prepare them for. McConnah made the decision in about 3 seconds. He told his loader to forget the armor-piercing and load white phosphorus, and then he started shooting. The 3rd Panther in the column tried to traverse its turret to engage McConaughey's position. The turret was still turning when McConaughey's next white-phosphorus round hit its side armor. Burning phosphorus splashed across the turret and ran down into the engine deck louvers. The Panther's engine was a Maybach HL230P30, a 12-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 700 horsepower. The engine compartment was ventilated through louvers on the rear deck to dissipate heat. Those louvers provided airflow to keep the engine cool. They also provided entry points for burning particles. White phosphorus particles falling through the engine deck louvers would land on hot engine components, fuel lines, and accumulated oil residue. The particles would continue burning. The engine compartment would fill with smoke. The crew would smell it immediately through the internal ventilation system. Within seconds, they would face a choice: stay in the tank and risk fire spreading to the crew compartment, or bail out while they still could. The third Panther's crew chose to bail out. The commander emerged from the turret hatch first, followed by the gunner and loader. The driver and bow gunner came out through their forward hatches. All 5 crew members abandoned the tank within 45 seconds of the white phosphorus impact. The tank was still operational. The engine was running, but the crew would not stay inside. McConaughey shifted his aim to the 4th Panther. This one had stopped and was attempting to back up while its turret traversed toward the American position. The German commander had identified the threat and was trying to engage. McConaughey's loader chambered another white phosphorus round. The Sherman's gun fired. The shell struck the Panther's turret front. Burning phosphorus erupted across the gun mantlet and splashed through the commander's cupola vision blocks. The Panther's turret stopped traversing. The tank continued reversing for another 15 yards, then stopped. The crew hatches opened. Smoke poured out. The crew evacuated. 4 Panthers neutralized in less than 3 minutes. None of them had been destroyed by armor penetration. None of them had suffered catastrophic internal damage. But all 4 were abandoned by their crews because burning white phosphorus made it impossible to remain inside. The remaining 4 Panthers in the column attempted to maneuver off the road. The lead tank, already crewless, sat blocking the road. The others tried to move around it through the fields. The ground was soft. 2 of the Panthers immediately bogged down in the mud. Their tracks churned and threw up dirt, but could not gain traction. They sat there trying to move while McConaughey's loader chambered another white phosphorus round. McConaughey engaged the nearest bogged Panther. The shell hit the turret side. Burning phosphorus covered the vision ports and ran down into the hull. The crew evacuated within 30 seconds. The second bogged Panther tried to traverse its gun toward the American position, but the turret traverse was slow and the gunner could not acquire a clear target through vision ports obscured by smoke from the other burning tanks. McConaughey put a white phosphorus round into its engine deck. The burning particles fell through the louvers. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out. 6 Panthers neutralized. 2 still operational and attempting to maneuver. One of them managed to get off the road and was moving through a field, trying to get into a position where it could engage the American tank. The other was reversing back down the road, trying to reach cover in the tree line. McConaughey's loader was pulling white phosphorus shells as fast as he could handle them. Each shell weighed about 14 pounds. The loader had to grab it from the ready rack, lift it to the breech, shove it in, and step back while the breech block closed automatically. Then the gunner would fire, the spent casing would eject, and the loader would start the process again. A well-trained crew could sustain 8 to 10 rounds per minute. McConaughey's crew was maintaining that rate. The Panther, trying to maneuver through the field, was struggling with the terrain. Its tracks were churning mud. The driver was trying to keep the tank moving, while the commander tried to direct the gunner onto target. McConaughey's next white phosphorus round hit the Panther's side armor, mid-hull. Burning particles splashed across the sponson and turret. Some fell through the turret basket and into the crew compartment. The smoke would be filling the interior immediately. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Panther crew evacuated. 7 down. The 8th Panther had reached the tree line and was reversing into cover. The commander was making the correct tactical decision. His 7 companion tanks had been neutralized in under 4 minutes. Staying in the open meant becoming the 8th casualty. The smart move was to withdraw, report contact, and let higher command decide how to respond. McConaughey could see the 8th Panther backing into the trees, but his angle was wrong for a clear shot. The tank was partially obscured by foliage. He held fire. Wasting a white phosphorus round on a low probability shot violated the same ammunition discipline he had been violating for the past 4 minutes. The 8th Panther disappeared into the tree line. A few moments later, McConaughey could hear its engine fading as it withdrew down a secondary road. 8 Panthers had advanced down that road. 7 sat abandoned in the fields. 1 had escaped. McConaughey's Sherman had fired 8 white phosphorus rounds. None of them had achieved armor penetration. None of them had destroyed a tank by conventional measures. But 7 tanks were no longer combat effective, and their crews were somewhere in the fields trying to figure out what had just happened to them. The engagement lasted approximately 4 minutes from the first shot to the last. McConaughey's crew sat in their Sherman watching the abandoned Panthers for several minutes to make sure the crews did not attempt to return to their vehicles. Smoke was still pouring from several of the tanks, where white phosphorus continued burning in the engine compartments. The smell of burning phosphorus carried across the fields, a distinctive odor that every soldier who encountered it remembered. Phosphorus smoke has a particular character. It is thick and white and clings to the ground. It irritates the eyes and throat. Soldiers who have breathed it describe a burning sensation in the lungs. The particles themselves are worse. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to air. It burns at temperatures high enough to ignite cloth, wood, and flesh. Water does not extinguish it. Smothering works if you can completely exclude oxygen. But burning particles are difficult to smother when they are scattered across a steel surface or have fallen into inaccessible spaces in an engine compartment. The German tank crews who abandoned their Panthers near Hechtel that morning understood these properties. They had seen what white phosphorus did to infantry positions. They knew that once it started burning inside a tank, getting it out was nearly impossible. The choice between staying in a tank filling with phosphorus smoke or evacuating into open ground under potential fire was not really a choice. You evacuated and hoped the Americans were not shooting dismounted crew. McConaughey's battalion commander arrived at the position about 30 minutes after the engagement. He had heard the firing and came forward to assess the situation. When he saw 7 abandoned Panthers sitting in the fields, he asked what had happened. McConaughey's tank commander explained that they had engaged the Panthers with white phosphorus and the crews had bailed out. The battalion commander walked out to examine the closest Panther. The tank was still operational, mechanically. The engine had been shut down by the crew when they evacuated, but there was no structural damage. The armor had not been penetrated. The gun was intact. The tracks were functional. The only damage was burning residue on the exterior hull and smoke damage in the engine compartment where phosphorus particles had fallen through the louvers. The tank could probably be made operational again with some cleanup and maintenance. The battalion commander returned to McConaughey's Sherman and asked how many white phosphorus rounds they had fired. McConaughey said 8 rounds, 7 hits, 7 tanks neutralized. The commander asked if McConaughey understood that white phosphorus was not anti-tank ammunition and that using it against armored vehicles violated standing orders. McConaughey said he understood the orders, but also understood that 7 Panthers were now abandoned in that field. The battalion commander looked at the abandoned tanks for a long moment. Then he told McConaughey that the report would reflect that the Panthers were engaged with appropriate ammunition and neutralized by direct fire. He did not specify which type of ammunition. He told McConaughey to continue holding the junction and to engage any additional enemy armor with whatever ammunition he judged most effective. Then he left. That conversation established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the fall of 1944. Official doctrine said white phosphorus was smoke ammunition. Practical experience demonstrated that white phosphorus could neutralize enemy tanks by forcing their crews to evacuate. tank commanders, faced with the choice between following doctrine and surviving combat, increasingly chose survival. The psychological effect of white phosphorus on tank crews was rooted in several factors. First was the immediate physical threat. Burning phosphorus particles landing on or near a tank created a fire hazard that could not be easily controlled. If particles fell into the engine compartment, they would continue burning and could ignite fuel lines or hydraulic fluid. The crew could smell smoke immediately. They could see it, filling the compartment through internal vision devices. Second was the sensory overload. White phosphorus produced thick smoke that reduced visibility to zero within seconds. Tank crews operating in already confined spaces with limited visibility found themselves suddenly unable to see anything. The smoke burned the eyes and throat. Breathing became difficult. The crew could not effectively operate the tank if they could not see and could not breathe. Third was the knowledge of what white phosphorus did to human tissue. Every soldier had seen the effects on infantry casualties. Phosphorus particles that contacted skin would burn through cloth and flesh. The burns were deep and painful and difficult to treat. Water would not put them out. The soldiers who had witnessed white phosphorus casualties understood that staying in a confined space where burning particles might be falling was risking similar injuries. Fourth was the time pressure. Once smoke started filling a tank, the crew had a very short window to make a decision. They could stay and try to fight through the smoke, hoping the fire would not spread, or they could evacuate immediately while the hatches were still accessible and before smoke inhalation incapacitated them. The decision had to be made in seconds. Most crews chose evacuation because the alternative meant risking being trapped inside a burning vehicle. These factors combined to create a psychological effect that official testing had not predicted. The Aberdeen Proving Ground had evaluated white phosphorus shells against various targets. The testing demonstrated that the shells could not penetrate armor. The heat was insufficient to damage internal components through intact armor plate. The official conclusion was that white phosphorus had minimal anti-armor capability, but the testing did not account for crew psychology. It did not measure how German tank crews would respond when burning particles fell into their engine compartments or when smoke filled their crew compartments. The testing assumed crews would continue operating their vehicles under adverse conditions. Combat experience demonstrated that this assumption was incorrect. By October 1944, reports of white phosphorus being used against German armor were appearing in after-action reports across First Army sectors. The pattern was consistent. Tank crews would engage German armor with white phosphorus. The German crews would evacuate their vehicles. The tanks would be captured intact or destroyed by follow-on forces. The official doctrine remained unchanged, but the practice was spreading. The 3rd Armored Division's experience near Stolberg in mid-October illustrated how widespread the practice had become. During fighting for the Siegfried Line fortifications, Sherman tanks from the 32nd Armored Regiment engaged a company of Panther tanks defending a road junction. The American tanks used white phosphorus exclusively. Within 20 minutes, 11 Panthers had been abandoned by their crews. 2 more were destroyed by armor-piercing rounds after their crews evacuated. The divisional after-action report noted that white phosphorus had proven highly effective at neutralizing enemy armor without requiring armor penetration. The report recommended that tank crews be officially authorized to use white phosphorus against armored targets when tactical conditions warranted. The recommendation was not adopted by higher headquarters, but it was not rejected either. The official position remained that white phosphorus was smoke ammunition, but field commanders were not being disciplined for using it against tanks. This created a situation where doctrine and practice diverged completely. Training manuals still described white phosphorus as smoke ammunition. Gunnery instructors at Fort Knox still taught that armor-piercing rounds were the correct ammunition for engaging tanks. But crews arriving in Europe were being told by veterans that Willie Pete worked better than AP against buttoned-up German tanks. The informal knowledge transfer happened in maintenance areas, during resupply operations, in field hospitals, where wounded tankers shared experiences. A replacement crew would arrive at their unit, and the veterans would tell them what actually worked. versus what the manual said. Use white phosphorus against tanks. If you can get a hit on the turret or engine deck, the crew will bail out. You don't need penetration. You just need to make them think their tank is burning. German forces began adapting to this tactic by late October. Reports from Wehrmacht units described American forces using phosphorus shells against armored vehicles with increasing frequency. German tank commanders were instructed to maintain position even when hit by phosphorus rounds, unless actual fire developed inside the crew compartment. Standing orders emphasized that phosphorus could not penetrate armor and that evacuating unnecessarily meant losing the vehicle. But changing behavior through orders is difficult when the behavior is driven by survival instinct. German crews who had experienced white phosphorus hits understood the danger. They had seen tanks burn. They had seen crew members with phosphorus burns. The official orders said, "Stay in your tank," but their instincts said, "Evacuate before you cannot get out." Most crews continued evacuating when hit by white phosphorus, regardless of what the orders said. The Wehrmacht attempted to mitigate the problem through technical modifications. Some units began fabricating screens or covers for engine deck louvers to prevent burning particles from falling into the engine compartment. These field modifications had limited effectiveness because the screens restricted airflow and caused engines to overheat. Tank crews had to choose between protection from phosphorus and adequate engine cooling. Most chose cooling because an overheated engine would disable the tank just as effectively as phosphorus. Other German units tried using external stowage and equipment to shield vulnerable areas. Spare track links were mounted on turret sides and rear hull sections. Canvas tarps were secured over engine decks. These measures provided some protection, but added weight and created maintenance problems. The modifications also did nothing to address the smoke and visibility problems when phosphorus hit near vision ports or commanders' cupolas. The First Army's ammunition supply system began adjusting to the increased demand for white phosphorus by November 1944. Ordnance units noticed that tank battalions were requesting white phosphorus shells at rates far exceeding doctrinal planning factors. A typical Sherman tank carried 35 to 40 rounds of 75mm ammunition in various types. Doctrinal load planning allocated approximately 10% for white phosphorus, with the majority being armor-piercing and high explosive. But tank units were requesting white phosphorus loads of 20 to 30% by late 1944. Some units wanted even higher percentages. The Ordnance Corps had to adjust production and distribution to meet the demand. This required increasing manufacturing capacity at plants producing white phosphorus filler and shell assemblies. It also required changing the standard ammunition loads shipped to forward units. The production challenges were significant. White phosphorus ammunition was more complex to manufacture than conventional shells. The phosphorus filler had to be handled carefully to prevent premature ignition. Quality control was critical because improperly assembled shells could detonate prematurely or fail to function correctly. The manufacturing facilities were already operating at capacity producing conventional ammunition. Adding additional white phosphorus production meant reducing output of other shell types or building new production lines. The Ordnance Corps chose to build additional production capacity. By December 1944, white phosphorus shell production had increased by approximately 40% compared to mid-year levels. The increased production went almost entirely to units in Europe where demand was highest. Pacific theater units continued receiving white phosphorus at doctrinal planning levels because the tactical situation there did not create the same demand. The cost per round for white phosphorus was approximately 3 times higher than armor-piercing ammunition. Each M48 white phosphorus shell cost about $12 to manufacture in 1944. An M61 armor-piercing shell cost about $4. For tank units firing hundreds of rounds per week, the cost difference was substantial, but the Army accepted the higher costs because white phosphorus was proving effective at neutralizing German armor. German intelligence officers analyzing captured American ammunition noticed the increased proportion of white phosphorus shells by late 1944. Reports to higher headquarters described American tank units carrying unusually large quantities of phosphorus ammunition. German commanders interpreted this as preparation for smoke screening operations supporting infantry advances. Few recognized that the Americans were using white phosphorus as de facto anti-tank ammunition. This intelligence failure meant German forces did not develop effective countermeasures. If German commanders had understood that white phosphorus was being used primarily against tanks rather than for smoke screening, they might have developed different tactical responses. They might have emphasized crew discipline more strongly. They might have developed better technical solutions for protecting vulnerable areas. Instead, they continued treating white phosphorus as a secondary threat while the tactic continued spreading through American armor units. The battle for the Hürtgen Forest in November and December 1944 demonstrated both the effectiveness and limitations of white phosphorus against tanks in specific terrain. The forest fighting occurred in dense woods where visibility was limited and engagement ranges were short. German armor operating in the forest used the terrain for protection, positioning tanks in defilade positions with only turrets exposed. American tank crews found that white phosphorus was less effective in these conditions. Hits on turret fronts would produce smoke and burning particles, but the German crews could not always see the phosphorus because their vision was already limited by forest terrain. The psychological effect was reduced because crews were operating in conditions where visibility was already poor and threat assessment was difficult. Additionally, the forest canopy reduced the effectiveness of white phosphorus smoke. In open terrain, the thick white smoke would spread and persist, creating screening effects that lasted several minutes. In the forest, the smoke dissipated more quickly through the tree canopy. The tactical advantage of smoke screening was reduced, which meant white phosphorus was primarily useful only for its direct anti-personnel effects rather than its broader tactical effects. American tank commanders in the Hürtgen adapted by shifting back toward armor-piercing ammunition for anti-tank work. White phosphorus remained useful for suppressing German infantry positions in bunkers and fortified buildings, but its effectiveness against tanks was diminished by the terrain. This demonstrated that white phosphorus was not a universal solution, but rather a tactic that worked best in specific conditions. The conditions where white phosphorus proved most effective were open terrain with good visibility, medium engagement ranges of 300 to 600 yards, and situations where German tanks were moving or repositioning rather than in prepared defensive positions. These conditions existed frequently in the advance across France and Belgium. They existed less frequently in the Hürtgen Forest or in urban fighting. By January 1945, First Army Headquarters had accumulated enough after-action reports and ammunition expenditure data to recognize the pattern. Tank units were using white phosphorus against armor far more frequently than Doctrine anticipated. The unofficial practice had become standard procedure for many units. Headquarters faced a choice between formally changing Doctrine or continuing to ignore the divergence between official policy and actual practice. The decision was made to update field guidance without formally changing Doctrine. A technical bulletin was issued in late January 1945, acknowledging that white phosphorus ammunition had proven effective at forcing enemy tank crews to evacuate their vehicles. The bulletin stated that commanders could authorize the use of white phosphorus against armored targets when appropriate. This gave official sanction to a practice that had been occurring unofficially for months. The bulletin carefully avoided stating that white phosphorus should be considered anti-tank ammunition. It maintained the official position that the primary purpose was smoke and suppression, but it acknowledged the secondary effect of forcing crew evacuation and authorized commanders to exploit that effect when tactically useful. This bureaucratic language allowed the Army to update practice without admitting that Doctrine had been incorrect. Tank crews appreciated the clarification because it meant they would not face disciplinary action for using tactics that worked. Officers appreciated it because they could now officially support practices they had been unofficially condoning. The change in guidance did not significantly alter what was happening in the field because units were already using white phosphorus against tanks, but it aligned official policy with actual practice, which reduced the tension between following orders and surviving combat. The German Army never developed effective countermeasures to the white phosphorus tactic. By early 1945, German tank production was declining due to Allied bombing of industrial facilities and shortages of raw materials. The tanks that were being produced were increasingly being held in reserve for defensive operations, protecting German territory. Offensive operations that might have allowed German forces to capture American tanks and analyze their ammunition loads were becoming rare. German crews continued evacuating their tanks when hit by white phosphorus throughout the final months of the war. Some crews became more disciplined about assessing actual fire danger before evacuating, but most continued prioritizing immediate survival over vehicle preservation. The German Army's emphasis on crew survival, which had been appropriate earlier in the war when replacements were available, became problematic when crew replacements were plentiful, but tanks were scarce. By March 1945, some German tank battalions had lost more vehicles to crew evacuation after white phosphorus hits than to actual armor penetration by enemy fire. After-action reports from Wehrmacht units described entire platoons of tanks being abandoned in single engagements without any vehicles suffering catastrophic damage. The tanks were mechanically intact but useless because their crews would not remain inside them. This represented a complete reversal of the situation from 1943, when German tanks had technological and tactical advantages over Allied armor. The Panther and Tiger tanks that had dominated the battlefield in Normandy were being neutralized not by superior American tank design, but by a creative application of smoke ammunition that exploited crew psychology rather than armor penetration. William McConnah continued serving with the 3rd Armored Division through the final campaigns into Germany. His crew fought through the Rhineland, crossed the Rhine River in March 1945, and pushed into central Germany as German resistance collapsed. McConnah was promoted to technical sergeant and later to staff sergeant. He received the Bronze Star for his actions during the September fighting near Hechtel, though the citation did not specifically mention the engagement with the 8 Panthers. The citation read that Staff Sergeant McConnah distinguished himself by exceptional performance of duty and extraordinary heroism in combat operations. It noted his technical proficiency as a gunner and his leadership in training replacement crews. It described him as exemplifying the highest standards of the armored force. The citation was written in the standard language used for thousands of Bronze Star awards. It did not capture the specific moment when McConnah decided to violate doctrine and load white phosphorus instead of armor-piercing. McConnah survived the war and returned to Pennsylvania in late 1945. He resumed work as a machinist. He married in 1947 and raised 4 children. He rarely discussed his wartime service except with other veterans. When people asked what he did in the war, he would say he was a tank gunner in Europe. That was usually sufficient. Most people did not ask for details. The engagement near Hechtel, where McConnah neutralized 7 Panthers with white phosphorus, did not appear in official Army histories of the campaign. The 3rd Armored Division's operational records noted contact with German armor near Hechtel on September 17th, with multiple enemy tanks destroyed or captured, but the reports did not specify the ammunition used. The incident became one of thousands of small actions that collectively contributed to Allied victory, but did not individually merit historical attention. Robert Early, McConnah's loader during the engagement, was killed in action in December 1944 during fighting near Düren. He was loading ammunition during an engagement with German anti-tank guns when a round penetrated the Sherman's turret. Early was 20 years old. He was buried at Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. His grave marker lists his name, rank, unit, and date of death. It does not mention that he was the loader who chambered the white phosphorus rounds that neutralized 7 Panthers 3 months earlier. The other crew members survived the war. The tank commander returned to civilian life in Ohio. The driver settled in Michigan. The bow gunner moved to California. They maintained contact for several years after the war through occasional letters, but eventually the correspondence stopped. They had shared an experience that shaped their lives, but they moved forward into peacetime and did not dwell on the past. The tactical innovation of using white phosphorus against tanks spread beyond the European theater by early 1945. Units in Italy began adopting similar tactics when facing German armor in terrain where armor-piercing rounds were ineffective. Reports from the Italian campaign described white phosphorus being used successfully against German tanks in defensive positions where conventional ammunition could not achieve penetrations. Pacific theater units did not adopt the tactic widely because Japanese tank forces were limited by late 1944, and the types of tanks employed were generally lighter armor that American guns could penetrate with conventional ammunition. White phosphorus remained primarily a tool for suppressing infantry positions and clearing fortified structures in the Pacific fighting. The post-war analysis by the United States Army examined ammunition effectiveness during the European campaign. The studies noted that white phosphorus had been used against armored vehicles more frequently than pre-war doctrine anticipated. The analysis concluded that the tactic had been tactically effective at neutralizing enemy tanks without achieving armor penetration. The reports recommended that future doctrine should acknowledge the psychological effects of white phosphorus on tank crews, but doctrine changes slowly in military organizations. The official field manuals for tank gunnery published in 1946 and 1947 continued listing white phosphorus as smoke ammunition. The manuals noted that white phosphorus could have secondary anti-personnel effects, but did not emphasize its use against tanks. The lessons from combat experience were documented in after-action reports and historical studies, but they were not fully integrated into training doctrine for nearly a decade. The Korean War saw American armor units rediscover the effectiveness of white phosphorus against tanks. When facing North Korean T-34-85 tanks in 1950, American tank crews found that white phosphorus could force crew evacuation just as effectively as it had against German Panthers. The tactic was used successfully in multiple engagements during the early months of the war. By the 1950s, white phosphorus was officially recognized as having both smoke and anti-personnel applications. Training manuals described its effects on enemy morale and its ability to force troops out of fortified positions, but the specific tactic of using it against tanks remained somewhat unofficial, passed from experienced crews to new crews through informal knowledge transfer rather than formal training. The 7 Panthers that McConnah's crew neutralized near Hechtel in September 1944 were recovered by American forces the following day. Army ordnance teams examined the vehicles to assess damage. They found that none had suffered armor penetration. The damage was limited to burning residue on external surfaces and smoke damage in engine compartments. All 7 tanks could have been returned to service with cleaning and minor repairs. The tanks were photographed and their technical details were documented. Some components were salvaged for intelligence analysis. The hulls were eventually scrapped. None of the 7 tanks survive today. They exist only in maintenance records, intelligence reports, and the memories of the soldiers who were there. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 7 tanks were neutralized. 1 American Sherman fired 8 white phosphorus rounds. No American casualties. The tactical success was complete and utterly unremarkable by the standards of late 1944, when dozens of similar engagements were occurring across the front every day. But the engagement represented something significant about how wars are actually fought versus how doctrine says they should be fought. The manual said white phosphorus was smoke ammunition. Combat experience said white phosphorus could neutralize tanks by forcing crew evacuation. Tank crews faced with the choice between following doctrine and surviving chose survival. Officers faced with the choice between enforcing regulations and supporting effective tactics chose to support what worked. Higher headquarters, faced with evidence that unofficial practices were more effective than official doctrine, chose to update guidance without admitting doctrine had been wrong. This pattern of adaptation, improvisation, and eventual recognition characterized much of the American approach to combat in World War II. American forces did not always begin with the best equipment or tactics, but they adapted quickly to battlefield realities. They shared knowledge informally through soldier networks. They tested innovations under combat conditions. Officers, flexible enough to support effective practices, gave their units tactical advantages. The white phosphorus tactic was one example among many. The hedge cutter attachments that allowed tanks to breach Norman hedgerows, the tactics for clearing fortified buildings in urban fighting, the techniques for coordinating infantry and armor in combined arms operations. All of these developed through similar processes of field innovation, informal knowledge transfer, and eventual official recognition. The institutional army learned slowly, but it did learn. The gap between doctrine and practice that existed in 1944 had largely closed by 1945 as official guidance updated to reflect combat experience. The same patterns would repeat in subsequent conflicts as new tactical challenges required new solutions, and soldiers in contact developed adaptations faster than doctrine could change. William McConnah died in 1997 at age 77. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II with the 3rd Armored Division and his Bronze Star. It mentioned his career as a machinist and his family. It did not mention the morning in September 1944 when he violated doctrine and used smoke ammunition to neutralize 7 Panther tanks, because that was the choice that made sense in the moment. The story survives in division records and after-action reports filed in the National Archives. It survives in the memories of veterans who served with the 3rd Armored Division and learned the white-phosphorus tactic from crews like McConnah's. It survives as one example among thousands of how soldiers adapt doctrine to battlefield reality and how tactical innovation emerges from necessity rather than planning. The lesson is not that doctrine is useless or that soldiers should routinely ignore regulations. Doctrine exists for important reasons. It provides a baseline of shared knowledge. It establishes standards for training and operations. It creates predictability that allows units to coordinate complex actions. But doctrine cannot anticipate every situation. Combat presents problems that training did not cover. Soldiers in contact must make decisions based on what is actually happening rather than what the manual says should happen. Officers must decide whether to enforce regulations or support effective practices. Organizations must balance the need for standardization against the need for adaptation. The white-phosphorus story illustrates that balance. The doctrine was not entirely wrong. White phosphorus was smoke ammunition, and it remained useful for that purpose throughout the war. But the doctrine was incomplete. It failed to account for the psychological effects on enemy tank crews. Combat experience revealed that limitation, and soldiers adapted. The institution eventually recognized the adaptation and updated its guidance. That process of recognition and adaptation is how military organizations learn. Not through perfect doctrine written before conflict begins, but through continuous adjustment based on battlefield experience. The gap between doctrine and practice will always exist because combat situations change faster than manuals can be rewritten. The question is whether the institution can learn quickly enough to capture useful adaptations before they become irrelevant. In 1944, the Army learned quickly enough. The white phosphorus tactic that soldiers developed unofficially in September received official sanction by January. That 4-month cycle from field innovation to doctrinal update was relatively fast for a large bureaucratic organization. It meant that units arriving in Europe in early 1945 could be trained on tactics that had proven effective in combat rather than discovering them independently through trial and error. The soldiers who developed and spread the tactic did not receive individual recognition. William McConnah got a Bronze Star, but so did thousands of other soldiers for routine, competent performance. The citation did not specifically mention his tactical innovation. The official histories did not record the engagement in detail. The names of the loader and driver and bowgunner who were in that Sherman do not appear in most accounts. They were ordinary soldiers doing their jobs under difficult conditions. They made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. They survived and moved on to the next engagement, and the one after that. Their contribution to Allied victory was real but unmeasurable. They were part of the vast collective effort that won the war through millions of individual actions that added up to strategic success. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.